There comes a moment in life when you wake up, not from sleep but from illusion. And after that awakening, something strange begins to happen. You start feeling tired of people, not angry, not hateful, just deeply, quietly exhausted. Their words feel loud, their reactions feel predictable, their presence, once comforting, now feels heavy, and you begin to wonder, what is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. This fatigue is not weakness, it is awareness. When the inner world begins to awaken, the outer world often feels unbearable. You start seeing beyond appearances. You notice how often people speak without meaning, connect without depth, and live without reflection. You realize how many interactions are driven by fear, validation, competition, or unconscious habits. And your soul, now alert, grows weary of pretending not to see. Before awakening, you lived through a persona, a social mask shaped by expectations. You laughed when expected, agreed when convenient, stayed silent when truth felt dangerous. But awakening dissolves that mask. And once the mask falls, being around others who still wear theirs becomes exhausting. You are not tired of people, you are tired of unconsciousness. Awakening sharpens perception. You sense hidden motives behind smiles. You feel unresolved wounds beneath casual conversations. You recognize projections, manipulations, and emotional games that once went unnoticed. And this constant seeing drains you, because awareness carries responsibility. You can no longer unknow what you know. This is why solitude begins to call you, not because you hate humanity, but because silence becomes honest. In solitude, you are no longer required to perform. You no longer need to translate your soul into acceptable language. You can breathe without explanation. And in that space you begin to meet yourself, not the self shaped by others, but the self that exists beneath conditioning. Many fear this stage and try to escape it. They force themselves to socialize. They numb themselves with noise, entertainment, or shallow connection. But this only deepens the exhaustion. Because the tiredness is not physical, it is spiritual. You are outgrowing old energies. When inner growth accelerates, misaligned relationships feel like emotional labor. Conversations that lack depth feel empty. Repetition feels suffocating. Drama feels childish. And you realize that not everyone can follow you into this new inner territory. Some will misunderstand your distance. Some will call you cold, arrogant, or changed. They are right about one thing: you have changed. But change is not betrayal. It is evolution. Awakening does not make you superior. It makes you selective. It teaches you that connection without authenticity is draining, and compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. You begin to understand that not every soul is meant to walk beside you. Some are meant to remain chapters, not lifelong companions. This tiredness is a transition. It is the space between who you were and who you are becoming. A psychological shedding. An inner reorganization. Your psyche is withdrawing energy from the external world to build a stronger internal foundation, and this process requires silence, patience, and courage. Do not rush to fill the emptiness. Do not force connection. Do not apologize for your need to withdraw. Because after this phase, something beautiful emerges. You begin to attract fewer people, but deeper ones. Conversations become slower, richer, more meaningful. You recognize souls, not roles. And when you connect, it no longer drains you. It nourishes you. You stop seeking to be understood by everyone. You start honoring being true to yourself. So if you feel tired of people after awakening, understand this: your soul is recalibrating. You are learning the difference between noise and truth, attachment and connection, loneliness and solitude. This tiredness is not the end of love for humanity. It is the beginning of conscious love, and conscious love always begins within. Awakening creates inner distance from superficial relationships. Expend it, and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. Awakening does not arrive gently. It enters like a quiet fracture in perception, altering the way relationships are experienced. What once felt natural begins to feel forced. Conversations that were once easy now feel hollow, repetitive, and strangely distant. This distance is not created by arrogance or rejection, but by awareness. When the inner eye opens, it begins to notice the invisible mechanics behind human interaction, the unspoken motivations, the emotional exchanges driven by habit rather than truth. Superficial relationships depend on unconscious agreement, on shared illusions that keep everything comfortable and predictable. Awakening disrupts this agreement. As awareness deepens, the psyche withdraws energy from what no longer nourishes it. Small talk feels like noise because it lacks meaning. Social rituals feel heavy because they demand performance instead of presence. There is an unspoken pressure in superficial relationships to maintain a version of the self that no longer exists. The awakened mind cannot return to that mask without exhaustion. Every forced smile, every automatic response, every hollow agreement drains vitality because it requires a betrayal of inner truth. This inner distance is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, but it is actually sensitivity. Awareness heightens perception, making emotional dissonance impossible to ignore. When words do not match intention, the tension is felt immediately. When connection lacks sincerity, the emptiness is palpable. The awakened individual is no longer able to participate in emotional exchanges that deny depth. This creates a silent separation, not chosen consciously, but emerging naturally as the psyche protects itself from fragmentation. Superficial relationships thrive on external validation, comparison, and social identity. Awakening shifts the center of gravity inward. Value is no longer derived from approval but from alignment. The need to be liked is replaced by the need to be real. This internal shift creates friction with relationships built on appearances, roles, and expectations. What once bonded now feels irrelevant, not because others have changed, but because perception has. The distance grows as a form of self-preservation. The psyche begins to conserve energy, withdrawing from interactions that demand conformity over authenticity. This withdrawal is often accompanied by guilt, confusion, and loneliness, because society teaches that constant social engagement equals health. Yet the soul knows otherwise. It recognizes that depth cannot coexist with constant distraction. Silence becomes restorative. Solitude becomes necessary, not as an escape from people, but as a return to inner coherence. There is also grief in this process. Awakening reveals that many connections were sustained by unconscious dependency rather than genuine resonance. Seeing this clearly can be painful. It dismantles nostalgia and exposes emotional habits that once provided comfort. The distance that forms is not only external but internal, separating the awakened self from its former identity. Relationships mirror this inner separation, reflecting the psychological transformation taking place. As the distance increases, observation replaces participation. The awakened individual sees patterns repeating, conversations looping, emotional reactions recycled. What once felt personal is now recognized as collective conditioning. This recognition does not breed contempt, but it dissolves illusion. Without illusion, superficial bonds lose their glue. They cannot survive without mutual unconsciousness. This distance is not permanent isolation. It is a transitional space where the psyche restructures itself. Old attachments fall away to make room for connection. The awakened individual becomes selective, not out of judgment, but out of necessity. Only relationships that allow truth, silence, and psychological depth can now sustain connection. Everything else fades naturally, without conflict, without drama, simply through lack of inner participation. Awakening does not reject people, it rejects falseness. The inner distance that forms is the soul's way of honoring its own evolution, creating space where authenticity can breathe and consciousness can continue to unfold. Fatigue with people is a sign of growing self-awareness. Expend it, and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. Fatigue with people often arrives unexpectedly, as if a veil has lifted and the ordinary world suddenly feels overwhelming. It is not physical exhaustion alone, though the body may feel it, nor is it simple irritation or boredom. It is a deeper, subtler weariness that settles into the psyche, a quiet recognition that interactions once effortless now demand energy that seems disproportionate to the exchange. This fatigue is intimately tied to self-awareness. As consciousness expands inward, the ordinary rhythms of social life, once invisible, become sharply defined. Each conversation, each social gesture, each emotional signal carries a weight that is felt more intensely. What once passed unnoticed is now scrutinized unconsciously, and the attention required to navigate the unconscious undercurrents of human behavior is inherently tiring. Growing self-awareness exposes the patterns behind human interaction. People are not merely individuals acting in isolation, they are expressions of collective conditioning, of learned behaviors, of habitual emotional responses. When one begins to perceive these patterns clearly, interactions that relied on assumption or automatic engagement no longer suffice. Fatigue emerges because the awakened mind cannot participate unconsciously in the same way. Small talk, pleasantries, superficial empathy, social politeness, and performative gestures all require a subtle but constant negotiation with falsity. This negotiation draws energy from the psyche because it conflicts with the emerging desire for authenticity. Self-awareness heightens sensitivity to emotional subtleties, and the emotional atmosphere of groups, friends, or even strangers becomes palpable. Hidden tensions, unspoken motives, and the unconscious projections of others are suddenly recognizable, and navigating these requires psychological effort. The tiredness that comes from this perception is not weakness, it is the natural consequence of engaging with layers of consciousness previously invisible. While before one may have moved fluidly through social settings without noticing the hidden dynamics, now every interaction involves subtle assessments and adjustments, whether conscious or unconscious, to maintain integrity. This effort, sustained over time, manifests as a profound fatigue. Furthermore, as self-awareness grows, there is a widening gap between inner truth and external expectation. Many interactions demand compromise with the inner self, either by silencing thoughts, moderating feelings, or performing a social role. Each compromise, no matter how minor, creates tension. The psyche resists compromise once it recognizes its own needs and boundaries more clearly. Fatigue emerges as a natural response to the repeated necessity of this resistance. It signals that the mind is beginning to prioritize authenticity over social conformity, and that superficial exchanges can no longer provide the same comfort they once did. The fatigue is also reflective of emotional refinement. As awareness grows, one begins to feel more acutely not only their own emotional states, but also the resonance of others. Encounters that are shallow, manipulative, or emotionally draining are no longer neutral experiences, they impact the psyche directly. Energy is expended on absorbing and processing the emotional signals of others, and when the interactions lack mutual depth or awareness, this energy is felt as exhaustion. The mind naturally begins to retreat from situations that offer minimal psychological nourishment, seeking instead the solitude or reflective space necessary to integrate understanding and process inner growth. In many ways, the fatigue is a protective mechanism, signaling the mind and body that attention must shift from external engagement to internal consolidation. It marks the transition from unconscious participation in the social world to conscious navigation. The self, once diffused across the expectations of others, begins to consolidate, and the cost of social interaction is recalibrated in relation to inner integrity. Fatigue arises because awareness no longer allows the mind to expend energy carelessly. It must be directed toward meaningful exchanges, toward understanding and self-realization. This growing tiredness is not a symptom of isolation, but a reflection of heightened discernment. The psyche begins to recognize the difference between energy-draining encounters and energy-nourishing ones. The more awareness expands, the more selective engagement becomes, and the more fatigue signals the necessity of boundaries. People themselves are not the source of exhaustion, it is the misalignment between superficial interaction and inner truth that requires constant negotiation and thereby produces the profound, unmistakable fatigue associated with self-awareness. The mask of society becomes unbearable after inner clarity. Expend it and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. When inner clarity emerges, the world around us begins to appear in a new light, and what was once familiar can suddenly feel constraining. The mask of society, the carefully constructed layers of behavior, expectation and convention that dictate how people present themselves, becomes increasingly unbearable. Before awakening, these social masks blend into the background. Manners, customs, and shared pretenses provide structure and comfort. They allow people to interact without confronting the deeper complexities of consciousness, morality, and emotional truth. But once clarity penetrates the inner life, these facades become glaringly obvious. What once seemed natural or acceptable now appears false, shallow, and energetically exhausting. Every social interaction requires navigating not only surface-level exchanges, but also the unspoken expectations embedded within them, and the mind begins to recognize the distance between outward appearance and inner reality. The mask of society functions as a mechanism of containment, keeping human behavior within predictable bounds. It smooths over conflicts, conceals discomfort, and regulates emotion in a way that maintains order. Those who have not awakened can participate without awareness because they are unconscious of the mask's presence. They are content to perform roles dictated by culture, habit, and peer pressure. But with inner clarity, one becomes acutely conscious of the artificiality in these roles. The smiles that hide contempt, the polite words that conceal indifference, the casual gestures that mask fear or insecurity, all of these become impossible to ignore. Every encounter with these masks subtly jars the awakened mind, because the discrepancy between the authentic self and the constructed self becomes undeniable. This awareness creates tension. There is a sense of friction between the inner world and the external environment, a growing realization that society demands compromises which feel increasingly intolerable. Rules of conduct, conventions, and rituals that were once comforting now seem restrictive. Social niceties which were designed to prevent conflict feel like a form of intellectual and emotional sedation. The clarity that arises within illuminates not only the superficiality of social roles, but also the unconscious agreements that sustain them. People act not from authenticity, but from learned patterns. And this repetitive conformity feels stifling to someone whose inner life has expanded beyond those patterns. As a result, there is a natural withdrawal. The awakened individual no longer has the energy or desire to participate fully in these performative interactions. Simple encounters become tiring because they require constant negotiation between inner truth and external expectation. Emotional labor increases, not because of overt difficulty, but because maintaining alignment with authenticity in the presence of collective pretense is demanding. The mind becomes sensitive to dissonance, perceiving in others the pressure to conform to roles that suppress genuine emotion, thought, and expression. This sensitivity makes it difficult to remain immersed in environments where superficiality dominates, and a quiet yet insistent sense of alienation begins to arise. This alienation is not caused by the people themselves, but by the structural dissonance between genuine consciousness and collective facade. One sees the world differently, one perceives the layers of disguise that mediate every social exchange. Interactions that were once enjoyable can feel hollow. Interactions that were once effortless now require vigilance. The mask of society is designed to smooth over differences, but for the awakened individual, it becomes a source of friction because it obscures authenticity, creativity, and inner truth. There is a growing reluctance to conform, to suppress thought or feeling for the sake of appearances. In many ways, the unmasking that accompanies inner clarity functions as both revelation and challenge. It illuminates the ways in which human interaction is often governed by fear, desire for approval, and unconscious habit rather than sincerity. The awakened mind senses this with precision, and repeated exposure to these social facades produces fatigue, tension, and a profound longing for spaces where the masks are absent. The psychological discomfort is inevitable because the energy expended to navigate societal expectations is no longer sustainable. Inner clarity demands honesty, and in a world built on pretense, honesty can feel isolating, exhausting, and unavoidable. The unmasking process compels a re-evaluation of connection, engagement, and personal boundaries. Social environments that once offered comfort now feel constrictive. Interactions require deliberation and discernment, and the inner self begins to assert its needs over the demands of external conformity. The mask of society, which once offered security and belonging, now feels like an unbearable weight pressing against the clarity of consciousness, challenging the individual to navigate existence with integrity and authenticity. Solitude becomes nourishment, not loneliness. Expend it, and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. When awakening begins to deepen, solitude transforms from an occasional refuge into a profound necessity. At first, solitude may feel like loneliness, a painful separation from the familiar rhythms of social life and human connection. The quiet hours, once filled with casual conversation, entertainment, or distraction, now echo with a raw sense of aloneness. This initial sensation is disorienting because it challenges long-held beliefs about fulfillment and the source of emotional sustenance. Human beings are conditioned to equate presence with connection, external engagement with value, and social validation with self-worth. When the inner world awakens, these assumptions are dismantled, and solitude no longer represents absence but presence of self, awareness and consciousness. The mind begins to understand that nourishment does not come exclusively from external affirmation but from the cultivation of inner depth. In solitude, one begins to encounter the layers of the self that were previously ignored or suppressed. Thoughts, feelings and memories that were buried in their distraction resurface, demanding attention and integration. In this space, self-reflection becomes a practice rather than a choice. Solitude allows for the observation of patterns, the recognition of unconscious drives and the reconciliation of conflicting aspects of personality. What was once interpreted as emptiness is now understood as fertile ground for growth, and the quietness becomes a canvas upon which the inner self can explore, reorganize and evolve. In solitude, emotional and psychological nourishment is found in awareness itself. When the mind is not constantly diverted by external stimuli, subtler perceptions emerge. One begins to notice the nuances of feeling, the rhythm of thought, and the depth of imagination. The small, often overlooked aspects of being, breath, sensation, memory, and intuition, become sources of sustenance. These experiences, though invisible to others, feed the psyche in ways that social interaction cannot replicate. The awakened mind begins to rely on these subtleties as a form of energy, replenishing itself in ways that superficial engagement never could. Solitude becomes a laboratory for the self, a place where insight, creativity and understanding can flourish without interruption or compromise. Furthermore, the quality of attention changes. In solitude, the mind can move beyond reactive consciousness and enter contemplative states where observation is not clouded by expectation or external pressure. Here, insight arises naturally. The psyche becomes both witness and participant in its own evolution. The stillness provides clarity, allowing one to disentangle emotional knots, resolve inner conflict, and integrate aspects of personality that were previously ignored or rejected. What was once experienced as emptiness now functions as the primary medium for transformation, and the mind begins to recognize that this process is nourishing rather than depleting. Solitude also cultivates autonomy, emotional dependence on others, the constant search for validation, and the unconscious mimicry of social behavior begin to fade. In this environment, the self discovers its intrinsic value, independent of external recognition. The awakened individual learns that fulfillment can emerge from within, and that authentic connection with oneself precedes authentic connection with others. This internal source of sustenance reduces the compulsion to fill time or attention with superficial interaction, transforming solitude into a space of self-replenishment rather than isolation. As the experience of solitude deepens, the distinction between being alone and being lonely becomes pronounced. Loneliness is characterized by absence, by yearning for what is external to the self. Solitude, by contrast, is characterized by presence, by the intimate encounter with one's own consciousness. Each moment spent in quiet observation, reflection, and self-compassion strengthens the internal reservoir of energy. The psyche learns to delight in its own company, finding pleasure not in distraction but in understanding, insight, and the subtle rhythms of thought and feeling. Through this process, the mind recalibrates its relationship with the world. Social interaction is no longer an obligation or a source of identity, but an option chosen consciously. The awakened individual discovers that nourishment is not given but created, and that solitude is not a deprivation but a source of energy, clarity, and strength that sustains the psyche in its journey toward wholeness, understanding, and conscious presence. Emotional exhaustion comes from outgrowing old identities. Expend it, and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. Emotional exhaustion often emerges quietly, almost imperceptibly, as a signal that the self is undergoing a profound transformation. It is not caused by the external demands of life alone, but by an internal shift that changes the very way one experiences the world and oneself. As the psyche grows, old identities begin to reveal themselves as incomplete, inauthentic, or limiting. These identities, constructed over years through conditioning, expectation, and survival mechanisms, once provided a sense of coherence, safety, and acceptance. They shaped behavior, dictated emotional responses, and framed the ways in which one related to others. Yet as consciousness expands, these familiar structures no longer suffice. What was once a source of comfort now feels constricting, and the tension between past identity and present awareness produces a deep, often invisible fatigue that permeates the emotional and psychological body. Outgrowing old identities is a process of shedding. Each layer of personality that was formed to meet external expectations, to conform to social norms, or to appease others becomes visible in its limitations. The behaviors, habits, and emotional patterns that once defined the self are recognized as adaptations rather than expressions of truth. This recognition brings with it an inherent strain. The mind, which had invested energy for years into maintaining these identities, now faces the paradox of continuing to act as though they remain valid, while simultaneously feeling drawn toward authenticity. The incongruence between the old self and the emerging self creates internal friction, which manifests as emotional exhaustion. It is the weariness of maintaining appearances when the psyche no longer resonates with them, the tiredness of performing roles that feel alien to the evolving consciousness. This exhaustion is compounded by the social consequences of outgrowing identities. Relationships, environments, and routines that once felt comfortable may now feel misaligned. The expectations of family, friends, and colleagues often assume the continuity of the old self. When the inner self begins to diverge, interactions that were once effortless become laborious. Small gestures, conversations, and social rituals may feel draining because they require a reconciliation between who one has been and who one is becoming. The emotional energy once allocated to connection and engagement is now divided, partly consumed by the inner process of transformation and the negotiation of external expectations. The fatigue also reflects the emotional intensity of identity dissolution. As old patterns are recognized and released, feelings long suppressed or ignored rise to the surface. Anger, grief, shame, and fear may surface in unexpected moments, demanding acknowledgement and integration. The psyche, in navigating this flood of previously unprocessed emotion, expends considerable energy. What once could be ignored or rationalized must now be confronted, understood, and assimilated. Emotional exhaustion emerges as a natural consequence of this deep work, signaling that the self is engaged in a process far more demanding than superficial tasks or social obligations. In addition, outgrowing old identities requires vigilance. One must observe habits, reactions, and thoughts with clarity, distinguishing between what arises from authentic desire and what is residue of conditioned behavior. This constant self-monitoring is taxing, as it involves both awareness and restraint. Impulses that were once automatic are now reconsidered. Emotional responses are measured against evolving standards of authenticity. The mental effort required for this alignment contributes to the sense of fatigue, as the mind can no longer function on autopilot, and every interaction, decision, and thought becomes part of the ongoing process of self-redefinition. Moreover, the emotional exhaustion is paradoxical in that it accompanies both loss and gain. The old self, with all its comforts, familiarity, and predictable patterns, is relinquished, creating a sense of void and disorientation. At the same time, a new sense of freedom, authenticity, and inner coherence is emerging. The tension between mourning what is left behind and embracing what is seen creates an intense but necessary strain on the psyche. The exhaustion is therefore a sign, a marker of growth, an indication that the old self is being left behind in favor of something more aligned, conscious, and integrated. Through this process, the mind and heart gradually adapt to the emerging self. Emotional exhaustion signals that boundaries, priorities, and energy allocation must be recalibrated. Life that once flowed effortlessly through old patterns now requires the conscious participation of the evolving consciousness, demanding both patience and self-compassion. It is the exhaustion of outgrowing, shedding, and reclaiming oneself, a necessary stage in the journey toward authenticity, wholeness, and a life lived in alignment with inner truth. True connection begins only after self-integration. Expend it, and don't heading any ending sentence in 600 words. True connection is not immediate. It is not built on proximity, convenience, or habitual interaction. It emerges slowly, quietly, and only after the self has been fully engaged, explored, and integrated. In the absence of self-integration, relationships tend to function on the level of projection, need, or expectation. People seek companionship to fill gaps within themselves, relying on others to supply validation, distraction, or emotional stability. Interactions often mirror unconscious patterns, past wounds, and fragmented aspects of the psyche, creating connections that feel compelling yet incomplete. They provide temporary relief, fleeting pleasure, or superficial intimacy, but they lack the depth and resonance that arise from wholeness. True connection, by contrast, is an expression of a mind and heart that are coherent, aligned, and reconciled internally. Self-integration is the process of gathering the fractured pieces of the psyche into a cohesive whole. It involves the acknowledgement and acceptance of all aspects of the self, including shadow traits, unprocessed emotions, suppressed desires, and latent potentials. Before integration, individuals often oscillate between roles, masks, and external expectations, creating inconsistency in behavior and emotional presence. The internal division prevents genuine resonance with others because one cannot offer fully what one has not yet claimed internally. The fragmented self seeks in others what it cannot provide to itself, projecting needs, fears, and hopes onto relationships, which inevitably leads to misalignment and misunderstanding. Only when the self is reconciled, coherent, and aware can connection transcend the superficial and reach a plane of authenticity. In the process of integration, one encounters the uncomfortable and often hidden aspects of personality. Anger, fear, grief, jealousy, and shame are explored, acknowledged, and assimilated into conscious awareness. Each confrontation strengthens the internal foundation, allowing the psyche to operate from a place of stability rather than reactivity. With this stability comes a kind of emotional independence that does not isolate but instead enables more authentic interaction. When a person is no longer dependent on others to define, validate, or complete them, they become capable of offering presence, empathy, and understanding without conditions. The connection that follows is not driven by need but by conscious engagement, and this shift transforms relationships from transactional to transformative. Self-integration also brings clarity regarding values, desires, and boundaries. One begins to discern what is nourishing and what is draining, what aligns with inner truth and what contradicts it. This discernment filters interactions naturally, attracting people whose energy, intention, and presence resonate with one's own. It reduces entanglement with individuals who operate from superficiality, insecurity, or unconscious projection, allowing space for relationships that are mutually supportive, authentic, and growth-oriented, without self-integration. Even well-intentioned interactions may trigger unconscious patterns, repeating old wounds and creating cycles of frustration. Furthermore, true connection requires vulnerability, the willingness to present oneself without pretense or defense. Vulnerability is only possible when the self is integrated because it demands a secure sense of identity. A fragmented or unacknowledged psyche cannot safely expose its inner reality without fear of dissolution, rejection, or manipulation. Self-integration provides the stability necessary to risk intimacy without losing oneself, to communicate honestly, to respond authentically, and to remain grounded even when confronted with the unknown or challenging aspects of another. In this state, relationships become mirrors rather than battlegrounds. They reflect truth without distorting it, revealing patterns without judgment, and offering resonance without obligation. Connection ceases to be a source of confusion or emotional depletion, and instead becomes a channel for shared growth, understanding, and depth. The energy exchanged is balanced, nourishing, and enlivening. The presence of another person no longer threatens or destabilizes because the foundation of connection rests within, not without. Ultimately, connection that occurs after self-integration is rare precisely because it demands courage, honesty, and commitment to inner work. It is not the casual meeting of two personalities, but the alignment of conscious, aware selves. In this way, intimacy is experienced not as a merging that obscures individuality, but as a harmonious resonance between distinct, whole, and authentic beings. The connection deepens because it is no longer contingent upon the filling of gaps or the correction of deficits, but arises naturally from the completeness and integrity of each self, creating relationships that are profound, enduring, and transformative.